Hello. Good morning, everybody. With a delay of 7 minutes, we will start the morning session. My name is Arie Kacowicz from the Department of International Relations at the University of Jerusalem, and I want to thank the Tammy Steinman Center for bringing me by train from Jerusalem to chair this morning session. We'll deal with implications of international involvement in ethno-national conflicts. Let me briefly present our three panelists and perhaps improvise a couple of words on the issues that we are going to deal in the next hour and a half. This is a panel that I would say it's intermestic. It's at the nexus between international relations and domestic issues. And it deals with ethno-national conflicts, which are the wars of the third kind that we have nowadays, because we don't have any more international wars and conflicts. And it deals with the role of third parties as mediators, and it deals with the different instruments that third parties, whether it's the international community, the West, the EU, they have available political, diplomatic, economic, and military instruments and different strategies: crisis management, conflict prevention, peacemaking, ethnic reconciliation. And what is also interesting, it deals with successes and failures of Western engagement in three different regions. So it's also a comparative panel. Since we are going to hear this morning about the EU, its successes and failures regarding Yugoslavia, East and Central Europe, we are going also to hear about Central Asia and how the West has coped with the problems there. And we are going to hear, surprise, surprise, about our own region, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the involvement of third parties. So let me go according to the order of the program and present briefly our three panelists. The first panelist will be Janusz Bugajski, and I apologize if I pronounce that more or less correctly. They do the same with my own name. Janusz Bugajski is the director of the New European Democratic Project and senior fellow in the European program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He has a number of books dealing with America, Europe, and East European relations. I just quote a couple of them. The recent one, America's Atlantic Bridges, America's New European Allies. His second book, Cold Peace, Russia's New Imperialism, from 2004, Political Parties of Eastern Europe, 2002. And he will present the first paper dealing with resolving ethnic conflicts, successes and failures in European Union policy. The second panelist will be Margarita Assenova. I realize Bugajska, meaning that there is a family link here. And Margarita is the executive director of the Institute for New Democracies in Washington, D.C., which is an NGO dealing with political liberalization, human rights, civil liberties. Regarding the areas of Central Asia, a professional journalist by training for many, many years. She also has a long list of articles, and she has been involved in issues related to Central Asia, and her talk will refer to Islam, ethnicity, and security in Central Asia. Our first speaker, the local one, that's Professor Galia Golan. I don't have a CV, but I improvised one, a former teacher of mine at Hebrew University. Galia, she's a professor at the Lauder School of Government at Herzeliya at the Interdisciplinary Center, and she had previously a long career at Hebrew University as the Darwin Professor of Soviet and East European Studies, a former chair of Political Science Department, chair of the Laffer Center for Women's Studies. And like many of us, she's also a peace activist, not just there at the Ivory Tower. She has written not 8 books, as I knew until this morning, but even 9 books. The forthcoming book is called Israel and Palestine, Peace Plans from Oslo to Disengagement. And it's appearing right now in a couple of months. And Galia Golan will address the issue of the international community and the efforts to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Since those are huge and fascinating subjects, I will still ask the panelists to restrict themselves up to 20 minutes and no more, so that will allow us for some time for discussion. Thank you, and let's, Janusz, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're awake. I hope I wake you up if you're not awake, but anyway, I'll try. What I'll do is try and summarize my paper, which is fairly long. It's about 50-odd pages. And basically, my argument is this, that since the collapse of East Europe's communist regimes, the European Union, we used to be the European Commission, has registered both successes and failures in its approach towards this so-called new frontier along its eastern and southeastern borders. I think the specter of escalating ethnic tensions and potential interstate conflicts preoccupied and perplexed all international actors, including the EU, for over 15 years. In ex-Yugoslavia, I believe that weak and ambiguous signals to the protagonists, particularly in the early 90s, may have actually exacerbated and prolonged the conflict, even while European officials and West European capitals lobbied for ceasefires and compromises between the protagonists. Moreover, the EU did not have a credible combat force at its disposal that could have been dispatched to the emerging crisis zones, and no member state was willing to take the lead in military action. EU influence remained even weaker, and its policy impact more nebulous in former Soviet republics and in newly emerging states such as Moldova and Georgia, which also experienced state fractures or secessionist wars in the early 90s. By contrast, I would argue that in Central Europe, the Baltic region, and eventually in the two Eastern Balkan states, what we call Eastern Balkans, Romania and Bulgaria, the European Union proved more resolute in offering conditional entry to states in transition towards democratic capitalism. Indeed, membership itself has proved to be the Union's most important foreign policy tool in promoting structural reform and diminishing prospects for violent conflict and state collapse. Despite its relative success, the European Union has still to reconcile itself with the failure to handle the disintegration of Yugoslavia. The consequences, which are still felt to this day, the consequences this has generated for nationhood, state building, ethnic relations, and international engagement in the Western Balkans. EU officials and those of many member states have also fallen short in providing a compelling vision of European membership and multi-ethnic coexistence for the former Soviet republics, aside from the three Baltic states. The paper actually examines the effectiveness of EU's instruments, political, economic, military, and so forth, in resolving these new conflicts, these post-communist conflicts, by looking at 5 strategies since the early 1990s. Crisis management, there is some overlap, of course, but I basically outlined 5. Crisis management, conflict prevention, peace enforcement, state building, and institutional integration. Let me begin very briefly with crisis management. During the late 80s and early 90s, the European Union was the European community, together with the United States, the United Nations, and other international organizations, failed to acknowledge the extent of nationalist, secessionist, and state-building aspirations in expiring communist states in much of Eastern Europe. International actors were unable to prevent state fracture in the 3 communist federations, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union, or to counter the rise of nationalist extremism and ethnic polarization, especially in post-Tito Yugoslavia and parts of the former Soviet Union. The rise of Slobodan Milosevic in capturing the party and state leadership in Serbia during the late 80s was not treated with sufficient serious concern in European capitals for several reasons. First, Yugoslavia was viewed as a relatively liberalizing communist state, and the struggle for power between leaders of different Yugoslav republics was initially perceived as an outcome of growing pluralism and political competition. Second, Milosevic exploited traditionally cordial ties that Titoist Yugoslavia had developed with the West European countries to undercut any criticisms of his attempts to re-centralize the post-Tito federation. Third, there was little understanding at high political levels in most of the EU capitals concerning the aspirations of the non-Serb republics for independence and statehood, and their growing fears of forceful centralization by Belgrade. And fourth, the focus of international attention was fixed on the countries of the Soviet bloc that were facing mounting public pressures for political and economic change in the early 90s, as well as on the potential fallout from the disintegration of the USSR. The Europeans clearly failed to offer the reformist federal government, Yugoslav federal government of Prime Minister Ante Markovic, with any significant incentives for the constituent republics to stay together, as prospects for a closer link for Yugoslavia with the European community were not seriously considered. Furthermore, the Milosevic regime in Serbia calculated that with the US preoccupied in the Gulf War, the EC divided and incapable of joint military action, the road was clear to stage a military crackdown against wayward Yugoslav republics. Despite its failure to forestall escalating political crisis and eventual descent into war, some credit, I do believe, may be given to the EC in helping to deter a spillover of violent conflict from Yugoslavia into neighboring states and regions. Strong diplomatic support for democratization in the former Soviet bloc contributed to smoothing the transition from monopartyism to pluralism, and the encouragement of market reform helped to bring to the forefront a more liberal political stratum that looked to the West for a model of capitalist democracy. As a result, the ultranationalist, expansionist or irredentist forces had limited influence among most of the countries bordering Yugoslavia. Paradoxically, I would also add the major factor for the containment of the Yugoslav conflict was a result of the communist era separation between non-aligned Yugoslavia and the Soviet bloc. Social contacts between these countries remained extremely limited, borders were tightly sealed, little information about Yugoslavia's domestic developments filtered into nearby countries, such as Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, or Hungary. As a consequence, there was little, if any, political or public mobilization on behalf of potentially endangered national minorities in Serbia, Croatia, Macedonia, or Kosovo. Furthermore, all the neighboring states were preoccupied with their own domestic transformations, with little time to focus on regional or international policy. Second issue, conflict prevention. In Yugoslavia, European Union policy failed to deter military and paramilitary mobilization, the mass murder and mass expulsion of civilians, and forced ethnic separation. International involvement was also unable to counter the secessionist wars in parts of the former Soviet Union, especially in Moldova, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. In countries where Moscow continued to exert considerable influence through political, economic, and security service connections, the Europeans had little leverage either on the central governments seceding from the Soviet Union or on local political leaders intent on separating territories from the newly independent states. The wars of the Yugoslav secession, which I look at in a little bit more detail, during the 90s proved the most instructive case study of policy failure by the European powers, where the Europeans were believed to possess some reservoir of political and economic influence, and where the seceding capitals, in particular Slovenia and Croatia, appealed to Brussels and the West European capitals for assistance and arbitration. Evidently, the international diplomatic and economic consequences of military action were evidently international diplomatic and economic consequences short of military action were insufficient to deter Belgrade. The absence of an EU foreign security policy or a deployable EU military force, and the unwillingness of any EU member state to send troops to the seceding republics, as well as the absence of US leadership, actually encouraged military intervention by Yugoslav forces and paramilitary units. Most West European leaders sought to maintain the integrity of Yugoslavia. Milosevic was able to play on these sentiments to depict the regime as an integralist force that would help stabilize the Balkans. In reality, the war was generated by the Yugoslav military and paramilitary forces who possessed a preponderance of weapons and other military assets. In essence, Belgrade conducted a war of aggression to keep the Yugoslav Federation together, and when it was unable to prevent the secession of the northern republics, it engaged in a war of territorial aggrandizement and ethnic purification designed to create a greater Serbia from the remnants of Yugoslavia. After several months of bargaining and diplomatic pressure during the summer of '91, the Europeans managed to broker a moratorium for both Slovenia and Croatia in their declaration of independence, but this move neither forestalled the armed conflict nor ensured international recognition at that time for the two republics. In addition, the Europeans were very much split between Germans and other powers whether and when to recognize the new republics. Croatia, in particular, at that time, in the summer of '91, remained exposed to military attrition orchestrated by Belgrade, and no international power intervened during the 6 months of ethnic-focused warfare. Eventually, Croatia was recognized by the international powers. A United Nations force was dispatched to the territory, with a substantial component from several EEC member states assembled in these 4 UN protected areas. I think a second panel is going to go into more detail on these issues. The idea was to create a buffer between Croatian and Serbian forces and eventually integrate these territories into Croatia. However, the Croatian authorities under Tudjman believed that the UN presence would actually consolidate Serbian gains in the territory and eventually lead to a partition of the country. Hence, in early '95, Tudjman, in order to end the stalemate and to force out the Serb militias, to force out eventually, the foreign troops whose presence in Zagreb feared was solidifying the Serbian hold on the Krajina, Zagreb disregarded the UN presence, ignored EU warnings against a military offensive, and mounted a military operation, first of all in Western Slavonia, and eventually during Operation Storm in August '95 against the bulk of the Krajina, the Kninska Krajina. Very quickly, the Bosnian War, I believe, was an even starker example of the failure of the Europeans to prevent armed conflict. After 3 months of fighting, which broke out in April '92, Bosnian Serb forces, with the direct assistance of Belgrade, had already expelled tens of thousands of Bosnian Muslims from the eastern regions of the country. And unwilling to use force to prevent potential genocide, instead, the United Nations mounted a humanitarian operation initially in order to try and feed and give shelter and other resources to the besieged populations of several safe zones. Ultimately, I do believe that the European Union can be credited with recognizing the key culprits in the Yugoslav conflict and pushing to impose international sanctions primarily against the Milosevic regime, after it became clear that the Serbian authorities were directly aiding the Bosnian Serb forces in their military assault and what I call an anti-civil war. In other words, a war basically against civilians for the purpose of permanent ethnic separation. However, I do believe that the economic embargo that was imposed on the remnants of Yugoslavia, Serbia and Montenegro, did not really terminate the war. What it did was, I think, to create, in some ways, even greater legitimacy for a besieged Serbia. It created a whole new stratum of very corrupt officials, not that they weren't corrupt to begin with, but I think it increased the power of these smuggling and organized criminal organizations and their links with the major political players, both in Serbia but also in neighboring countries, even those countries outside of Yugoslavia. Very quickly, as time is running out. 3, peace enforcement. As the war intensified in Bosnia in '93-94, the Europeans, the UN, and other international agencies failed to deter an escalation of hostilities, slaughter of civilians, and mass refugee outflows. Of course, there was criticisms of rightly so, I do believe, of the American administration for failing to provide diplomatic leadership in ending the conflict. But it was evident, I think, that few effective levers were available without not just the threat of force, but the direct use of force against the combatants, especially against the superior Serbian units, which were unwilling to provide, which the Europeans were unwilling to provide for several reasons. The Americans also were unwilling to provide leadership, whether it was Vietnam syndrome, whether it was calculation that the conflict was containable within ex-Yugoslavia, or whether it was the fact that attention was focused elsewhere. Eventually, when the Americans did get involved initially with creating the Bosnian Federation between Croats and Muslims, in the summer of '95, we had major action which led eventually to the Dayton Accords. I don't think it was simply the fact of NATO bombing at the time which persuaded the Serbs to come to the negotiating table. I think at that point the Serbs calculated that militarily, in a way, they had extended as far as they could by the summer of '95, plus, of course, the Croatian offensives within the Krajina, neighboring territories, and their actions together with the Bosnian Muslims in which parts of western Bosnia were taken back from Serb units, the danger that Banja Luka itself would potentially fall. I think this persuaded the Serbs actually to come to the negotiating table. Eventually we had the Dayton Accords. My argument, I know 5 minutes, my argument in the next 5 minutes is that the Dayton Accords were primarily an American effort. The Europeans were involved, but in a subsidiary position. This is really American, finally American leadership backed by military force, but not so much by American military force, but by Croatian and potentially Bosnian Muslim military force, which could have rolled back all the Serbian gains. Fourth, and I'll sort of hurry up a little bit, state building. The EU, working together with the US and various international agencies, has experienced major shortcomings in politically restitching multi-ethnic states and building authoritative central government institutions in former war zones. That's a generalization, but I believe in the most pertinent and complex example of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the NATO intervention and subsequent peace enforcement operations were successful in diminishing armed hostilities and protecting civilians, but the politics of state building has proved much more problematic. It took a long time, a long session of negotiations before the Bosnian government at the central level was finally formed, after months of obstruction by Bosnian Serb forces. In addition, the complex government structure with ethnic proportionality for the three major nations contributed to the malaise and often paralyzed central government institutions. The three major nationalist parties continued to win elections, posing as the protectors, defenders of national interests of their nationality. And in many respects, this has persisted to this day, although under some leadership, leadership of some of the high representatives, including Paddy Ashdown, there has been greater effort to streamline the state, to make the central government in Sarajevo more effective, and to limit the veto powers of the two entities, and to create centralized institutions, particularly in the security realm. My last point is in terms of institutional integration. I think it's been increasingly evident, particularly since the failed votes on the EU constitution over the past year, that there is a certain degree of ambiguity in integrating the West Balkan states into the European Union. And I think whether real or that's the way it's perceived, I think it has created a good deal of concern in the region that the EU will actually delay prospects for membership of most of these countries in the Western Balkans, not the former Yugoslav republics other than Slovenia, which is already in. Whether this is an exaggeration or not, I think that perception does tend to embolden some of the more isolationist forces, some of those powers that, or some of the governments that would otherwise have to perform major surgery in terms of reform, that may actually stall these reforms, delay these reforms, because there isn't that prospect of EU membership. And my last point is, there's a lot of material here, the last point is in terms of EU integration. The fact that there is a lack of prospect for EU membership, particularly for the three European CIS states, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, it is problematic in terms of their own reform paths, their own reform programs, and it's actually leading to some conflicts within the European Union in terms of difference of approach between some of the new members, the Central European states, that see, in terms of the Eastern dimension, that see the membership of their neighbors to the East as essential for solidifying a wider Europe, for providing for their own security, and for bringing these countries into more permanent institutional structure. So the problems are not resolved, I would say, in terms of potential future conflicts along Europe's eastern borders, in particular, particularly in Ukraine, but also Belarus and Moldova, both in terms of handling the secessionist movements in Transnistria and in terms of giving a strong signal that would stimulate economic and other reforms. I think the European Union at this point is falling short. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Do you want to?
Thank you very much. I keep saying that I became an optimist about the Balkans and Eastern Europe ever since I started working on Central Asia.
Everything is relative.
It is a very depressing situation in Central Asia, and it's potentially very explosive. And I think it's a largely neglected region by the Western community. I don't think that any of the EU or United States have clear strategy for Central Asia, and this is one of the problems that is going to exacerbate the entire situation. Well, the former communist countries in Eastern Europe are gradually becoming full-fledged democracies. The newly independent Central Asian republics of the former Soviet Union transformed into semi-autocratic or authoritarian regimes. Consolidation of national independence was accompanied by consolidation of power among the ex-communist elites, clan rivalries, and widespread official corruption. The last 15 years in Central Asia were marked by ethnic and regional divisions, armed conflicts, increasing influence of radical Islamic groups, and growing threat of terrorism. Prospects for decreasing tensions in the region are slim, with rising poverty levels, lack of opportunity for the younger generation, and state repression of official dissent, all resulting in successful recruitment of young people by radical Islamic groups. In addition, the Fergana Valley, administratively divided between Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, with its complex ethnic composition and population particularly susceptible to radical Islamic ideas, is likely to continue being a major source of unrest. Despite the initial warm reception, Western influence in the region is diminishing, with the Central Asian governments turning back to Russia in the wake of the colored revolutions in Georgia, Ukraine, and presumably Kyrgyzstan, although I would not put it in the line of those revolutions. While Moscow is taking assertive steps to restore its former zone of influence, the United States and the European Union seem indecisive on the importance of the region to their own strategic and security interests. The United States missed the opportunity for more robust economic engagement in Central Asia in the 90s and later after its re-engagement, upon its re-engagement after 9/11 terrorist attacks. Its military presence in the region did not materialize into closer political relations or economic benefits for the host countries. The European Union lacks a clear strategy for the region, which remains on its periphery, on the periphery of its attention. However, the potential destabilization in Central Asia would present a serious threat to European and US security, since the region could become a breeding ground for terrorists and could undermine the stability of several governments and threaten increasingly vital energy supplies from the Caspian Basin. Although ethnic divisions, the penetration of political Islam, and terrorism rank high on the list of contemporary threats to security in Central Asia, any one of them separately could not cause a major security breakdown in the region. However, the combination of several risk factors, including repressive domestic policies, can cause a conflict of a smaller or bigger scale, with the worst-case scenario resulting in regional spillover of violence. While radical Islam and terrorism remain the major hard threats to security and stability in Central Asia, repressive government policies, a deficit of democracy and the rule of law, widespread poverty, and rampant official corruption exacerbate and multiply these threats. Terrorist bombings, armed incursions, and insurgency outbreaks have cost human lives and material destruction in the past several years. But the mission of political Islam in Central Asia will only succeed if it capitalizes on growing public discontent with abusive and incompetent governments. The events in Andijan last May 2005, presented a quintessential example of this type of danger. The Uzbek authorities' violent suppression of a classic insurgency operation that used civilian disgruntlement with poverty for its own political purposes caused a crisis with major domestic and international consequences. In addition, ethnic divisions, clan politics, regional separatism can play a significant role in causing or exploiting potential unrest or conflict, particularly if group interests are threatened. In the next few years, the Central Asian states will confront the issue of succession of the old Soviet-time leadership that has continued ruling the region since independence. So far, none of the political leaders in the region has demonstrated a desire to utilize ethnic or regional divisions for political purposes, as it happened in the Balkans. But this might change if the elites that are well protected by the powerful security services are threatened with the loss of power and economic privileges. So the list of problems in Central Asia today is long. There is not a single problem that doesn't exist there. Starting from undemocratic authoritarian regimes, weak state institutions that fail to deliver services to the population. At the same time, very strong security services that make some of those states police states. Underdeveloped or undeveloped economically, the countries are really underdeveloped. On top of everything, the economy is actually going down. The rates are dropping in some of the countries except for Kazakhstan. The ethnic tensions can result in separatism. They have had already clashes on ethnic base in the Fergana Valley, but not to the extent to cause an ethnic war. Islamic radicalism that is resulting from the split in Islam in the region, with the new teachings of radical Islam coming to Central Asia that contradict the old traditional moderate Islamic tradition that's been there for centuries. The crisis of identity, that's both ethnic and religious identity, the crime, corruption, the border disputes, the breaking through very porous borders that are available for drugs and for person smuggling, the tribal and clan politics that are traditional for centuries as well, not very well understood by the West, largely underestimated, under-evaluated in their meaning in politics by the Western powers. This all together with the leadership that hasn't changed, the Soviet mentality that hasn't changed, this is a really, really neglected region of the world. So the post-communist transitions and why things are the situation at the position they are now. First of all, the Central Asian republics did not strive for independence. They did not have any dissident movements. They became independent almost by default because the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. Unlike the Baltic republics that struggled for independence and developed their own, at least ideas, oppositional ideas that later on transformed into political opposition, these countries did not have any political opposition when the changes came. Although the Russians introduced European education to the region due to religious traditions and tribal culture, the Western notion of democracy is not necessarily shared by all layers of the local societies. For centuries, they have maintained their own community values based on moderate Islamic tradition and patriarchal systems. The geographical distance from Europe and the Euro-Atlantic space also made unapplicable the system of incentives that added impetus to democratic reforms in Eastern Europe. There was no way that anyone would offer membership in NATO or EU that served as incredible incentive for all Eastern European countries to pursue democratic changes. As the new states focus on developing governing mechanisms and consolidating their independence, the Central Asian leadership used various tools in building national identity, mobilizing self-consciousness, ranging from encouraging a national and religious revival to authoritarian practices and personality cult. Rallying the unity of new nations to support their leaders was an essential part of nation building, but it also contributed to building effective autocracies. One important point that needs to be made here is that Central Asian states are not simply newly independent states. They are new states. They've never been states before, independent in a way they are within the borders that they have now. They have been different khanates and kingdoms in the past, but the Central Asian republics, the way we know them now, have never been independent states. So it's important to know also that the Soviet Union divided the countries the way they wanted, according to the policy of divide and rule. So the Fergana Valley, which is pretty compact, very populated, densely populated area, was split between two 3 countries. In each of these parts, there are minorities from the other 2 countries. In each of the Central Asian countries, there is a minority from the neighboring country, plus, in addition to that, a lot of Russians who came with, in the 19th century and later in the 20th century, moved to the region, Koreans, Tatars, the Jewish population that has lived there for 400 years, in Bukhara and Samarkand. There are also Ukrainians, there are Turks, Meskhetian Turks, there are Germans, there are Poles, because a lot of minorities, a lot of nationalities were simply dumped by Stalin in Central Asia. The Chechens 60 years ago, thousands of Chechens were deported from Chechnya to Uzbekistan and other countries in the region. So why the Central Asian republics did not make any progress from the very early post-totalitarian period? First of all, they needed to consolidate independence before they make any political progress. And this is natural. For new nations, for new countries, it's natural to focus on themselves and try to consolidate independence. But they didn't have the experience, they didn't have the tradition to build anything else but autocracy. All these countries have had historically autocratic governments. And it's not because they're Muslim countries, it's just their historical past is such. As the East European experience has demonstrated, the period of transition can be very messy, and apparently the leaders in Central Asia tried to avoid such messiness. They were reticent about democratization as a potential source of instability, in addition to their fears of losing power. Second, the Soviet leadership in most of these countries has not yet replaced the reformers. The leadership maintains a relatively strong security apparatus that is used in most states to protect the ruling elites. The security apparatus is not reformed, the mentality is not changed. It doesn't have the mentality to protect the people. It has the mentality to protect the state, which means the ruling elites. So if there is a demonstration, the security apparatus is going to arrest people, going to throw them to jail. In the case of Andijan, which is a little bit more complicated than simply a demonstration, simply shoot. Third, the civil society played little or no role in bringing about political change before the fall of the Soviet Empire. Subsequently, both the political opposition and the NGOs failed to develop a wide base in society and remained isolated from the traditional civil society establishments, such as the mahallas or the religional congregations. Fourth, a war erupted in Tajikistan in early 90s, in addition to violent inter-ethnic conflicts in Central Asia's Fergana Valley that inevitably obstructed the democratization process. Fifth, the region is threatened by growing Islamic extremism and terrorism. Exploiting the weakness of these states in reducing poverty and delivering essential services to their citizens, radical Islamic organizations are penetrating the region. They are targeting the young and restless population and trying to capture the traditional civil society establishments with their own political purpose. And sixth, the official corruption is widespread. The impeding effort, it's impeding the efforts at democratization. In addition, the leadership in some oil-rich countries such as Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan is not as oil-rich, but has some oil as well. Kazakhstan has grown; they have grown strongly resistant to Western promotion of liberal ideas. About the ethnic divisions and separatism. We have witnessed clashes in the Fergana Valley in the early 90s between Uzbeks and Kyrgyz over water resources. So this is one major issue. The scarce resources of the region, particularly water, is one, and in the picture of growing poverty, is one option of one possibility of ethnic rivalries that can grow in the future. In addition, the war in Tajikistan, it was not an ethnically based war, and it was not a really religiously based war, although the democratic Islamic opposition that had played great role in starting the war was riding on Islamic ideology. But it came to substitute the Soviet ideology, the communist ideology, came in a vacuum of other ideology. And religion played very little role in this war. It was caused mostly because the elites in the south were neglected The communists were recruiting leadership from the north mostly, and at the same time the elites, the newly economically mighty elites that developed in the south because of the drug trade with Afghanistan, that wanted power. One of the serious problems in Central Asia today is the crisis of identity owing to religious and ethnic rivalry. The complex ethnic composition of each country and the need to build nation-states inevitably clashes with the interests of the minority groups in societies that lack necessary protections of minority rights. Unlike the Balkans in the 90s, none of the current leaders in Central Asia, as I said before, indicated a political will to use ethnic differences for their own political interests. The absence of a serious intent to exploit ethnic divisions for political purposes on the scale of Slobodan Milosevic is the main reason right now for preserving ethnic peace for the last 15 years. In fact, most Central Asian government officials dislike the comparison with the Balkans, considering such analogies derogatory to the generally peaceful and tolerant Central Asian population. However, the button of ethnic sentiment can be easily pushed by a powerful political figure who is threatened by potential loss of control. At the time when the Central Asian countries are faced with political successions to the old guard, this potential danger cannot be ignored. Central Asia has witnessed two political successions since independence, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Neither of them was completely peaceful. You remember from last year, the Kyrgyzstan revolution, these were angry crowds that went to the streets. They were frustrated with poverty and corruption. They wanted political change. They didn't know what exactly they wanted. The problem was they didn't have a clear political leadership. There was no opposition to lead them. Fortunately, it resulted in a departure of President Akayev and his corrupt government and the establishment of new government. But unfortunately, this new government is not quite aware what is happening in the country. It's lawlessness throughout the country that allows more Islamic radicalism taking place, particularly in the south. The religious revival of all countries in Central Asia is the next point that I would like to make. Traditionally, the dominant form of Islam in Central Asia belongs to one of the most tolerant, flexible sects of Sunni Islam. They belong to the Hanafi Mazhab, the school of Islamic jurisprudence. This is moderate religion doctrine that encompasses local pre-Islamic rituals, and it's closely connected with the Sufi mystic tradition. Even the small communities related to Shia Islam in the region, such as the Ismailis in Tajikistan, they also belong to very moderate tradition. But what is happening now? It actually started happening since the late 70s, when the Soviet Union started bringing exchange students from Muslim countries to the region. That was part of the Cold War strategy of Soviet Union. A lot of teachings of different Islamic schools started coming to the region, contradicting these moderate traditions. After the fall of communism, the state-supported religion was already compromised because all these imams were called the red imams. They were subversived by the Soviets, and they were reporting to them, as in all post-communist communist countries. The clergy were reporting to the communists about, and they were submitting to them. So this moderate tradition is compromised. The split in clergy was natural, as it happened in all Eastern European countries. In most of the churches, Christian and the muftis, there was split after the changes because of the ideological, practically, differences. So this new wave of teaching of Islam was not necessarily moderate. It came from Iran, it came from Saudi Arabia, it came from the Salafi tradition of Islam. With it came Islamic movements such as Hizb ut-Tahrir. Gradually, terrorist organization based on political Islam was formed, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, that caused a lot of trouble in the 1999 bombings in Tashkent, 2004, two series of bombings in Tashkent again. The Andijan insurgency is also most likely to be attributed to Islamic movements, but with a little bit a different angle, because Crimea, that was blamed for the insurgency in Andijan, it actually is a group of businessmen who were developing Islamic charities. They were helping the population, they were developing businesses, they were making donations, they were gathering people around them. It was related to groups studying Islam. Practically, they were penetrating the civil society, gaining support among the population, and at the moment they were arrested by the regime that doesn't tolerate any dissent, religious or political. The population rightfully protested for a week for their release, but there were also militants that used this opportunity to practically come and organize a jailbreak, releasing of about 600 prisoners, arming them, attacking military barracks before that to take weapons, and police stations to take weapons, and after that taking the municipality, taking hostages, using the civilian population as civilian shield. And when the security forces, which do not know anything better but shoot at people, came at the end of the day, the shooting started. Hundreds of civilians were killed. We don't know how many. The government says 187. Other sources say up to 700. But 187 is not a little number. The last point I'm going to make, and I'll finish in a couple of minutes, is after Andijan, the region became practically isolated, more Uzbekistan in particular, completely isolated from the international community. The United States objectives in Central Asia clear. It's democracy, peace, stability, security, but the freedom agenda, the way it's formulated right now, is causing fear among the leadership of losing power, and it's not really working. These are semi-authoritarian states that we need to develop a better strategy for promoting democracy, for policy change within the regime. The European Union, as I said, doesn't have a clear strategy. And the prospects for democratization are diminishing because of the reluctance of the regime to make any changes, and because of our inability to develop strategies to operate in countries that are practically very different. We need to use our strategies from the Helsinki process before 1989 rather than strategies that we used after 1989 to promote democracy in the region. And I'll talk more about it during the question session.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry. Galia, please. Bring us back to the region, although you are also an expert on those areas.
Let's see what we've got here.
I'm sorry, it's okay.
It did make me nostalgic for the Soviet Union. It's going to warm up. Okay, it's coming. It's coming. It's coming. Yep, just had to warm up. Well,
International unity.
That's a great one. Get that out. There we go. Okay. Yeah, international unity. I'm a Sovietologist, so I've turned into an historian, and I will be doing a bit of history. I took the title very seriously that I gave, International Community and Resolution of Conflict. That is to say, I'm clearly talking about resolution and not about management or anything else. I'm also not talking about involvement in wars, of which there's been quite a bit. And when I talk about the international community, obviously we're talking about many possible actors, states, collectives, organizations, individuals, NGOs, facilitators, emissaries. And also when I talk about the international community, I'm talking international. I sort of arbitrarily leave the region, actors from the region out. Also, there are certainly many forms of involvement. official, unofficial, track 1, track 2, mediation, humanitarian involvement, peacemaking, peace-building, peacekeeping, the whole works. And of course also one needs to look into the motivations or the interests of the international community or the international actors themselves. And there's also an indirect effect or role of the international community in terms of a context or the environment in which one operates, whether there's a Cold War going on, globalization, the war on terrorism, and also, as mentioned yesterday, there is, of course, in recent years, a tremendous increase in international involvement in crises around the world, partially as a result of the end of the Cold War, partially as a result of globalization, and also a rise in at least the salience of human rights. To all of this mix, I think we have to add the attitude of the parties to the conflicts themselves, how they view international involvement and how they view the international actors getting involved themselves. The Arab states, if we go to our region, of course, the Arab states tended to look towards the international community, to powers, for one reason or another, basically to influence Israel, whether they look to the United States in order to have the United States influence Israel in the conflict, or they look to the Soviet Union to influence the United States to influence Israel. Either way, the Arab states did turn to the international community and to the superpowers specifically. The Palestinians, as the weakest party in the conflict, usually has favored international involvement, although not always. Certain types of international involvement, such as a trusteeship, are not favored, but on the whole they have, of course, favored international involvement, while Israel, on the other hand, has generally been opposed to it, with the possible exception, generally the exception of the United States. Israel, of course, I say of course because I think it's basically very well known that Israel perceives the European community and the United Nations as, if not hostile, not particularly friendly to Israel, or in other words, pro-Palestinian. But the motivations, I think, or the attitudes of Israel as well as the Palestinians are a bit more complicated than that, and there are signs here and there of changes, which I'll refer to later. But on the whole, I think it can be safely said that all the parties to the conflict have historically and continue to see the major importance of the United States, whether as a supporting power or as one that simply has a great deal of influence. So with all this in mind, I've tried to look at certain major international efforts at resolution. I think we can take a look. I'm not going to... I think we can take a look at these. I took key international efforts at resolution, not management of the conflict. I looked at the official efforts and efforts taken by official bodies, not the informal or track 2. You'll note there's very little of the United Nations or European initiatives here. There were European initiatives, but they're not there because they generally had very little effect, got very little attention. Basically, as we will see, it's the United States that seems to be the key in all of these. And also, of course, there are many purposes, not necessarily the mandate, but the forms of involvement: to initiate a negotiating process, to provide legitimacy, to mediate, to propose solutions, or to contribute to implementation. Obviously, any number of tasks can be involved. I wanted to look at 3 different types of involvement: unsuccessful in the 1967 to 1973 period, successful involvement, the Egyptian-Israeli peace, and what I would call a mixed success failure, that is Madrid and Oslo. Obviously, the ultimate success or failure of any of these efforts was dependent to a large degree on the parties to the conflict themselves. But if we look at the list, let's see if we can go back. If we look at the list, we'll see that international involvement was important and I think for the most part critical. Even when the international actor was not necessarily the initiator. The one exception would be, of course, Israel and Jordan, the Israeli and Jordanian peace, which is bilateral, although we could also argue that it was Oslo that made it possible, in other words, an international involvement prior. There's no time to go into all of these, or even the ones I want to go into, but I'll try some samples. The 1967 to 73 period, which was a period of intensive international involvement and initiatives, beginning, of course, with Security Council Resolution 242, which was a major multinational achievement and remains until this very day as the basis for negotiations and any agreement, though obviously the interpretations of 242 vary. From 242, we got the Yaring mission, the two-power talks, the four-power talks, and the whole approach to the conflict was international. First of all, the international approach viewed the conflict as a conflict between states, not between peoples or nations or ethnic groups. Palestinians were viewed, if at all, only as a refugee issue, which was, of course, one of the reasons that the PLO opposed Resolution 242 for a long time. Secondly, the approach of the international community, of the Yaring mission, and also of the superpowers, saw themselves as basically substituting for the Arabs and for Israel, sidestepping as a way of sidestepping bilateral talks, which is one of the reasons that Israel objected to these different missions, the Yaring mission and the two-power and four-power. And on the other hand, one of the reasons that the Arabs, or at least the Egyptians, accepted it. Acceptance of Resolution 242 by Egypt and Jordan implied recognition of Israel, but these states were not yet ready to come up with direct recognition, and they sidestepped it by means of these substitute or these proxy negotiators. The theory that the international community held at the time was that they could not provide solutions, but they could act as a catalyst or a stimulation for later negotiations or provide a framework for negotiations. But in fact, they did offer plans. Yaring offered plan, the Rogers plan, the Soviets came up with peace plans. These were comprehensive, unilateral initiatives. Occasionally, they showed it to their counterparts in the negotiations. Rarely, if ever, did they show them or coordinate them with their clients. Nor is it clear just how much the superpowers in these negotiations were actually interested in reaching resolution of the conflict. Kissinger and Rogers' differences, which I won't go into, but Kissinger basically was in no hurry to see anything happen because he wanted the Arabs to see that the Soviets couldn't deliver and then get rid of the Soviets. The Soviets themselves were not entirely sure what they wanted in this period. On the one hand, tension served much of their interests. On the other hand, they had to prove that they could deliver something to the Arabs and that they could deliver something that the Americans were not delivering. In any case, it's not at all certain what the intention was of the superpowers in this period of negotiations. We're not clear. It's not clear if they actually wanted to resolve the conflict or were looking for stabilization or trying to mediate. In any case, the failure was quite clear. And you could add to this list, even though it's after 1973, the end of 1973, we've got the Geneva Convention, the Geneva Conference. We deal with the Geneva Convention all the time. We got the Geneva Conference, which was, of course, an outgrowth of Soviet-American initiated ceasefire. Ostensibly, this was a joint effort for resolution of the conflict, but of course the Soviets failed to get the Syrians to the table, and the United States at this point was now opting for a step-by-step approach. There was altogether, in fact, a change in the in the nature of international involvement. Now, the next thing, of course, I'm just skipping over a number of things in the period before, and I will continue to do that in the period afterwards. But the next example I want to look at is the success that came basically after Geneva, in the form of international involvement. It's sort of strange at this point because immediately after the 73 war, the United States, that is Kissinger, actually brought about the Israeli-Syrian and certainly the Israeli-Syrian disengagement agreement. Kissinger directly involved in his shuttle diplomacy, which was not subtle, his shuttle diplomacy between Jerusalem and Damascus. And he actually did achieve stabilization. He didn't get anywhere near resolution. What he was looking for was stabilization. He got it, and that agreement, of course, the disengagement agreement, has held until this day. But the success comes mainly with the Israeli-Egyptian relationship. And here it's very interesting because Kissinger actually organized the disengagement talks immediately after the 73 war. Theoretically, they were under the UN, but the UN sent only a very junior official to officiate. And interestingly enough, when these talks took place, the United States was not directly involved. They organized it, but they weren't even informed about how these talks were going. And Kissinger, in fact, preferred to ignore the progress made in these talks, wanting to leave everything for the Geneva Conference, so that there could be this, first of all, international credit for whatever was achieved. He got it, of course, and the disengagements officially came after the Geneva Conference, and both superpowers wanted the signing in Geneva so that they could each have a role and demonstrate an international involvement in the whole thing. But and of course, the disengagements were under the United Nations and the two superpowers. But in fact, Egypt and Israel did not need the United States, did not need the United Nations, did not need Geneva for that agreement, for the bilateral agreement on disengagement. And it was this bilateral agreement that paved the way for the interim agreement of 1975 between Israel and Egypt. But here, the two sides did need international involvement. Actually, the United States. At this point, Egypt has already excluded the Soviets from any role in the conflict. And so we have Kissinger, who mediated this agreement. He actually offered alternative proposals and suggestions in his mediation. And he offered sanctions and incentives. This is a 1975 agreement. We have the reassessment, where Kissinger is angry with Israeli inflexibility, declares a 6-month, what turned out to be a 6-month reassessment. In the form of sanctions, he suspended some deliveries arms deliveries for a while, and so forth. He also offered incentives, though, $2 billion in aid each year, more aircraft, and also a promise to Israel not to talk to the PLO unless the PLO recognized Israel and renounced the use of terror. And also, this agreement was not only reached as a result of sanctions and incentives, but also direct American involvement or promised as for direct American involvement in implementation in the form of technicians, read intelligence on the ground. This was all necessary in order to persuade Israel to pull back to the points that were demanded in the Sinai, demanded by Egypt. And, of course, economic aid was offered to Egypt in order to give it incentives. Okay. I think I'll skip over a number of things here. But certainly, if we want to talk about the peace agreement, Camp David, obviously, these Camp David I, these were very largely in the hands of the United States. When I try to compare the periods, when I try to compare the period that's the lack of success before 73 and then the success that came afterwards, there are a number of things that come to mind in terms of the international involvement. One is perhaps, of course, the limited goal, reaching a step-by-step Kissinger with reaching a separate agreement, a separate peace. One might say, okay, the success came because the Soviets were not involved after 73. Although I think one tends to overestimate the degree of influence and control that the Soviets had, and I think also that as Kissinger himself determined, the Soviets could not stop an agreement if the Egyptians were interested in one. And that's, of course, ultimately what happened. We could argue that without Soviet backing, the Egyptians didn't have the kind of bargaining power they might have had otherwise, but it was, in fact, the Egyptians who got rid of the Soviets in the first place. And, of course, if we look at the comparison, there were differences in leadership, Nasser versus Sadat, Kissinger and Nixon versus Jimmy Carter, Golda Meir, and Yitzhak Rabin. And, of course, the international role changed significantly with these changes in leadership. And, of course, the role of the 73 war cannot be overlooked. Bearing all this in mind, the absence of the Soviet Union, change in leadership, the war itself, the limited nature of the agreement, I think we can still say that international involvement in the form of the United States was critical. It was not sufficient, perhaps, but it was necessary. And then I want to look finally at, more recently, at Madrid and Oslo, what I call a success and failure. I think similar conclusions can be drawn regarding the role of the international community, the international actors, and the international atmosphere, all being critical. Madrid was meant to be a comprehensive, to reach a comprehensive agreement, but became, as Geneva, a road to separate agreements. But at least it did give birth to the multilateral negotiations and to bilateral negotiations, including Syria and including the Palestinians. Not officially the PLO, but by the back door, the PLO as well. But these multilaterals could not really succeed. They made a lot of progress, but could not really ultimately succeed until and unless there was success at the bilateral level. The Madrid conference itself came out of the international community. That is to say, it came out of the first Iraq War, or the first Gulf War, because there was a commitment, as the Americans were building their coalition against Iraq, there was a commitment to the Arab states, and there was a commitment to Gorbachev for what was called, or could be called, sequential linkage. That is a commitment that once Iraq was out of Kuwait, once this war was over, they would, the international community, meaning the United States, would deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that's how Madrid was, of course, born. When we go from Madrid and the failure, in a sense, of the bilateral talks that followed Madrid, and that brings us, of course, to Oslo. And Oslo led to this failure of Madrid, what I would call a failure of Madrid, led to another international action, in this case the Track 2 effort initiated by Norway. And there are various accounts as to just what role Norway played in the There are different accounts as to just what role Norway played in the Oslo talks, in the negotiations there. They made suggestions, they made proposals, they acted as mediators. The Palestinians, in their accounts, tend to give the Norwegians a greater role, which is understandable, and Israelis, in their accounts of Oslo, tend to give the Norwegians almost no role whatsoever. The differences are not surprising. Here, of course, with Oslo, the Americans missed the boat. They had concentrated, like Yitzhak Rabin, on Syria, viewing Syria or the states, and this is the old attitude of the states being the threat to Israel, or the strategic threat to Israel, rather than the Palestinians. And so both the United States and Rabin had given priority to the Syrian track, which failed. But once, okay, we can handle that. But once Oslo came out of the closet, of course, the United States took it over, as we know, and became involved with Oslo, and in many ways was responsible for the early success, with the success that it did have. And I don't mean only the signing on the White House lawn, but all the subsequent agreements, and there were many in the what we call the Oslo Accords, all the subsequent negotiations, all the subsequent breakdowns, and then agreements that came out of them, all of these were basically negotiated or engineered by the United States. It was the United States pushed out just about every other actor, including the Norwegians. They gave the Norwegians this tiny, they gave them TIP, this tiny peacekeeping role in Hebron. But basically, with the exception of occasional entry of Egypt and Jordan to try to ease negotiations, basically the United States ran a solo show. In fact, one of the things that we could name or note as a major flaw with the Oslo Accords was, in fact, the absence of international involvement, certainly the absence of international monitoring, having limited it, as I said, to this very tiny group in Hebron. The genuine international monitoring, in fact, never entered into any of but there was the CIA was brought in to monitor Palestinian actions, but genuine international monitoring was not brought in until, or proposed seriously, until the roadmap. And even the roadmap deals with international monitoring in a very problematic way. I'm not saying that the absence of international monitoring was the reason for the failure of Oslo, but I think it was a significant factor that might have made a difference. Another factor that I want to mention in my 1 minute, I can take 1 minute, was the international environment and the role that that played in at least the initial period of Oslo. And there I think it was extremely important. Not only the Norwegian role played was important, and not only the direct American role, but also the estimates of both Israel and the PLO, that is, of the local actors. Their estimate of the international environment was critical, I think, in bringing about Oslo and bringing the two sides to the negotiating table. I don't belittle what was going on locally. I don't belittle the importance of the Intifada in bringing both sides to the negotiating table. But I think also there was tremendous response on both sides to the international atmosphere, where the PLO, Arafat, had been significantly weakened by the Gulf War because of support for Saddam Hussein. He lost, not only he had already lost Soviet backing when Gorbachev came to power. Now he also lost the financial backing of Saudi Arabia. The United States was the only superpower. There was a new world order. And Rabin as well recognized this difference, the importance of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the new world order, the effect that this would have on the Arab states, and the fact that the Arab states were also having to contend with the growth of Islamism, the problems of Iran, the spread of weapons of mass destruction. In other words, for both leaders, for both Arafat and Rabin, the international scene was a very important factor, if not a key factor, in bringing them to the negotiating table. Finally, I can't go into the role in Camp David and everything that we saw since then. I do want to mention two last things. One is the change in the attitude on the part of Israel with regard to the role of the international community. As we know, recently we've seen change, perhaps only the beginning of a change, permitting, actually asking the Europeans to assist in the disengagement and peace building in Gaza, the role of the Egyptians, of course, for peacekeeping on the border and so forth. And this is in addition, of course, to the usual U.S. involvement. The second thing I want to mention is the present circumstances with the unilateralism on both sides, that Hamas unilateralism today and the Israeli plans for unilateral realignment or something. I think neither of which, of course, is going to bring about resolution of the conflict or even agreement. I think perhaps it's time to look once again for some kind of model of international involvement. Thank you.
Well, Galia, you exceeded just 3 minutes. The question, Mordechai, can we take until 11:10 since we start 10 minutes late? That will give us about 20 minutes, and I will ask, I will not be discussing at all, so we'll get directly into the Q&A, and I will ask people to ask questions rather than, and we might accumulate questions. Yes, please.
I have a question for Margarita and for Galia, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. Margarita, you pointed out in what was an excellent presentation all of the problems of Central Asia, and you pointed out that it actually makes you look at other places with some degree of optimism. I'm reminded, however, of Samuel Johnson's observation about when you see a dog walking on its hind legs, and he pointed out that what's amazing is not how badly it was done, but that it was done at all. And so in terms of Central Asia, what strikes me is in 15 years, you have a long list of problems and issues that could have boiled over. But compared to, say, Georgia or Moldova or Karabakh and others that I can't think of at the moment, things have been managed relatively well. So the Osh problem in southern Kyrgyzstan has been a tinderbox, and there have been problems, but it's been contained. The Tajik Civil War was a brutal war, but the 97 peace accord has made things hold up relatively well. Certainly the alternative would be much worse. The big ticket item for Central Asian specialists was the worry that there would be a Russian irredentist movement in northern Kazakhstan, which would have created a huge crisis. That hasn't happened. The Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz both have managed the national problem relatively well. And so the question is, do you agree with this assessment, and how would you explain this if you did? To Galia, the question is, and I've asked every Israeli this question since since I've been here. They must be tired of me, but there's a division among Israelis, as far as I can tell, about the consequence of the coming to power of Hamas. One is that over time, because they're now responsible for making the trains run on time, as it were, that they will be domesticated and made more practical, and that there's some evidence already of a division between Khalid Mashal and Ismail Haniyeh, and this creates an opportunity for the Israelis to stitch together some peace plan involving radical adjustments of settlements and what have you. The other that I've also heard is that, well, we need to do nothing. The wall exists, suicide bombings have reduced. The Intifada of 87-91 showed that we can crush the Palestinians every time, and the status quo continues indefinitely, and we manage this problem perhaps for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And I was wondering whether you lean to one or the other of these perspectives.
Let's accommodate. Mark, yes.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask Margarita the same question as Raj did, but I'll ask in the interest of family equality. I'll ask Janusz a question. You outlined very well all of the failures of EU policy, but what you didn't necessarily give us is an explanation. And of course, there is you didn't deal with the successes, but what I'd like to hear is a little bit of an explanation of why the EU succeeds in some cases and doesn't succeed in other cases, and in particular the 5 tasks that you outlined. Some are harder than other tasks. So is it the nature of the task, or is it something else? Is there a temporal element here that's involved in EU policy, or what?
Actually, my question follows from Mark's also. First to Janusz. I was interested, obviously you covered a lot of ground and couldn't conceivably in your 20 minutes cover everything. But one episode which I find interesting, and I wonder what your view is, it doesn't get a lot of attention, but the ad hoc Italian-led multilateral deployment to Albania, Operation Alba in, was it 98? I'm trying to remember now. That I find interesting because it demonstrated that for all that the EU is lacking, it was possible at that particular juncture to actually put together what I think most observers would conclude was a very effective operation. Now, you can say that it was modest in its ambition, but actually I don't think it was terribly modest. I mean, it was inserting European troops into an unstable situation.
very critical Vice President Chini when he is saying that Nazarbayev is his good friend, but Nazarbayev has also kept these radicals all down. Maybe he's an ultimate realist in this one.
But we have two questions here. Marcelo, you have... Yeah, there are two questions.
Just very quickly, because we're running out of time, and try to tie some of the strings together, is that international relation, which is the approach that you presented, is based on taking for granted understanding that the system of states is actually a ruling system. And one thing that holding it together since World War II, more or less, is a consensus that borders don't change. This actually runs into the lecture last night of Paul James that was talking about the difference between interstate and intrastate or whatever. There are no interstate wars, partly because borders more or less cannot change. In that respect, I want to ask you maybe to make a comment. How that grid or that regime, what role it has in the events, especially in Yugoslavia and also in Israel-Palestine, and to Galia Golan especially, how come the whole world rallied against Iraq or against Serbia when they tried to change borders, and it's very, very, how shall I say, weak in trying to impose that kind of consensus, international consensus on Israel?
Yes, I have. I'll try not to comment, just to ask questions to Margarita. One is water. Many think that water is going to be a big problem and a big factor of destabilization in the future. Now about radical Islam. Two things, so-called radical Islam. One is that, of course, we have to take with a grain of salt the regime's declarations of fighting it. I personally doubt the IMU's involvement in the bombings in Tashkent. They don't have the ability, the technical ability for it.
organisations, other international processes of reconciliation, pathways to change, movements for discussion and dialogue that are occurring around the world, do they have any capacity for making a difference? Because it seems to me, as I hear all the papers, that the ones that are doing the high-level negotiation from the United Nations down to NATO and the United States, they're not doing very well.
That's probably a topic for another panel. There is a bias here, state-centric. I resist the temptation of asking myself questions. Each of you will have up to 2 to 3 minutes, up to, so we should get some break. Okay? We can start by the same order, so we can start with you. Okay.
2 minutes is going to be difficult, but actually, Mark, I do go through some of the explanations. If you look at Sorry. If you look at the paper, I do go through some of the explanations. The list is longer in terms of the failures than it is for the successes. I know. But I did mention some of them, the divisions within the EU, the fact it didn't have a military force, particularly when dealing with Yugoslavia, the fact that they misinterpreted in a way the conflict to begin with. I think that was a problem. In other words,
can I just say, those are all reasons for failure.
Right. I'm talking about failure now.
What's success versus failure, if you look in a larger perspective?
Well, the successes, again, it's relative. The successes the biggest success to my mind has been the integration process, the inclusion of at least 8 of the Central European states into the EU, and the promise of the inclusion of the other Balkan states also into the European Union, because that's been a stimulus, I think, for reform process, a very specific reform process. It's helped the pro-market, pro-liberal, pro-Western elements within these countries. It's taken focus of taking focus of ethnic issues. Even NATO membership, I would say, has also helped in that process. So that's the biggest success I look at. I also look at the successes, relative successes, once there was a decision to act vis-a-vis Yugoslavia, particularly in putting in the force in Bosnia after '95, after Dayton, and the degree to which the European Union played a role in that. I mean, I think they did play a subsidiary role. They weren't the lead role, but they did play a subsidiary role in the fact that there wasn't division over the fact that this was an acceptable agreement. But as I said, that I think the failures looking back are bigger than the successes. Well, you could argue it two ways that Montenegro was a success. It was only 0.5% made it a success. If that referendum vote had dropped below 55%. 2 weeks ago, then we would have had a new crisis on our hands in Montenegro. In other words, we would have had a completely new ball game with the majority being disenfranchised, or in fact the majority losing. There was management crisis, but it can be argued both ways. You're managing crisis, but actually you're prolonging the crisis. You're prolonging what you're trying to manage rather than coming to a resolution. And I think Kosovo, Dan will talk about later on, you could argue, two arguments. One, the quicker you resolve it, the better. People have to bite the bullet and reconcile themselves to the fact that it's done. Or the other argument, the longer you delay it, the less important somehow it will play, that emotions will die down and that both sides will be exhausted and more likely to accept an agreement. I tend to go with the first option. But I just want to go with the other ones. You mentioned Alba. I think it was an important operation up to a point. Remember, it was very different. There weren't two armies facing each other. You had basically a collapse of state authority, and most of the population welcomed any kind of outside force to come in, particularly, there's goodwill towards Italians. But there was also an international element, multinational element involved in this. So this was a success because of the nature of the nature of the collapse of the state in Albania, not complete collapse, but relative collapse, and the fact there was no internecine, there was no ethnic element, no regional conflicts, even though some commentators and journalists I mentioned earlier tried to paint it as such. So I think it was a much easier conflict to handle in that respect. The other question, I wasn't sure, somebody asked about this no border changes. Why was there... Yeah, I think you did. Why was... Sorry? Oren did, yeah.
Look at the difference between Montenegro and Kosovo. It exactly illustrates this point. Kosovo is within Serbia, supposedly, and Montenegro is not. It can actually secede quite quietly.
Well, yeah, but this was part of the... The three communist federations, all of them in the constitutions, each republic had the right to secede, not the autonomous regions. And this is the problem with Kosovo. If Kosovo had been a republic, even though it had federal status, it had voting rights and all the other rights, 8 units did, 6 republics, 2 autonomous units, but Kosovo did not have the right to secede. This is the problem. If it had been a Montenegrin situation, it would have been easier. The problem for Montenegro is they didn't have the majority that the Albanians do in Kosovo to make it an easy election, a quick referendum, as happened in Croatia and Slovenia. I think that's it, basically. It's over my 2 minutes.
I can't bring it. It's a shame that I gave you your final grade. Now you're head of the department. Such a great student. Okay. I'm going to take the easy way out with two of the questions on a model of involvement that is third-party involvement and the issue of Track 2 and informal things. The institutes that have, the centers that have sponsored this conference have each held conferences on each of those subjects. And I think I even spoke in each of them, because there's a tremendous amount to be said that Track 2, and I happen to believe that Track 2 has contributed up to a point, and there's just no time to go into it now, but certainly some things have been written on it, and I believe that it can have an effect. There's a reevaluation right now of the people-to-people activities, and generally they're considered to have failed, but here too I'm a minority voice that says I don't believe they have entirely failed. And on third-party, there is a lot of work being done on models of third-party involvement that is even bringing in a force to bring order. The Palestinians are very shy about the idea of a trusteeship or a third party coming in with a force. It's been suggested to get Israel out, to have a third party come into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, or maybe only the Gaza Strip. The Palestinians are very, very hesitant on that, as much as they do want a third party involvement. But again, that's a whole topic in itself. International consensus against Israel. It's interesting because in Israel one tends to ask the question is, why is it the whole world concentrates and always talks so much about us? I was in Fiji, and on the front page of this local Fiji paper there's something about Arik Sharon's condition deteriorating or something. Whether there are conflicts going on elsewhere and oppression and even genocide. I think it's Berkowitz counted up that we are the most mediated conflict around, period. Having said that, I do think one of the answers might be the United States, plain and simple. If we look at the superpowers and whose interests were involved when an act in a rousing international response, I think the role of the United States, the power of the United States has made the difference. Just one last thing, Raj. I think basically there are four positions, not two. One is with regard to Hamas, the idea that they are not monolithic. There are differences. And maybe in time they can be brought to a moderate position the way the PLO was ultimately in 1988 after 15 years of internal dissent and so forth, or the way the IRA was, or ETA recently. There is that theory that, and there are different ideas as to what it would take to make that difference. But that's certainly one school of thought. The second school of thought says that it is monolithic, and the only way to handle it is a total boycott, which will lead to collapse, and then get something in its place. And those are the two attitudes towards the Hamas, or what the policy should be. The other two attitudes, when you mentioned that the conflict is not solvable. In other words, the move towards conflict management rather than conflict resolution. And there certainly is a very strong school of thought in Israel that believes that this conflict it's not possible to resolve it. The differences are too great, whether they talk about specifics, too many settlements, or if they talk about the right of return being, of course, a zero-sum issue. Whatever the reason. And there's some basic ideological factors. I mean, there is a whole stream of Zionism that from the beginning believed that there was no possibility of coexistence or resolution. The other school, the fourth school, that I belong to, is that a negotiated settlement is possible, that we were very close to one, that the parameters are very clear, and while the issues that remain, and the issues that remain are the right of return and Jerusalem, that these issues, there are proposals out there for dealing with. This is what my last book is on. But there's no question about it that these are two schools of thought. And if you look at the conflict as intractable and not resolvable, it doesn't matter whether it's Hamas or it's Abu Mazen.
Margarita, you have the last word.
Very quickly. Problems have been contained. This is true until now, but they have been managed. They haven't been solved. And these are underlying, this is the background of the situation, the ethnic differences. It might never explode if there is no political leader to do it, to exploit it, to engineer ethnic conflict for his own political purpose. I believe that Islam has been playing a positive role in many of these conflicts to contain to maintain the peace, because the local tradition is very moderate and it has impacted different minorities because this is the only common thing between them, to stay in peace with each other. But now with the radical teachings coming that are contradicting each other and the moderate local tradition, this is an entire new situation of conflict within Islam. And the larger these movements grow, right now the estimate is about 20,000 maybe members of Hizb ut-Tahrir, relatively very small number, may never be a factor unless it's allowed to grow. That's why at the beginning I said one factor is not going to be enough. There got to be several coming together in order to become a security security threat situation. The most important is radical Islam is growing particularly because of the suppression of the government, of the repressive governments that do not know how to deal and don't want to deal in any other way with security threats. They have real security threats. They do. There is proof that the bombings were organized by IMU. A cell was discovered in Kazakhstan soon after the bombings, in the fall after the bombings in 2004. The link was made between IMU and splinter groups of IMU and the bombings. There is a serious security threat, and they're learning good tactics. They know how to do it. The using of civilian shields in Andijan was pretty sophisticated, classic guerrilla warfare tactic that they implemented. The question is whether the government's intelligent enough to deal with these security threats in a way that they should, and how many governments in the world really know how to deal with such a complex tactical situation as they had in Andijan. We had in the United States similar situations, and the result was devastating. A lot of deaths, Waco and other cases. So the question is, do we let them just? I'm focusing particularly on Uzbekistan as the critical country in the region because Islam has the deepest roots there, because the Uzbek minorities in other countries are being recruited more intensively by Hizb ut-Tahrir and other groups than the other ethnic groups in the region. The Kyrgyz and Kazakh Islam was adopted much later, so it's kind of more on a surface, superficial a belief. It's not deep-rooted as it is in Uzbekistan because it exists for about 12 centuries now. So, Uzbekistan is the country to watch. Half of the population in Central Asia lives there. This is one of the most repressive regimes after Turkmenistan, but Turkmenistan is so contained by the Turkmenbashi, who doesn't allow any movement. So conflict there is less likely, even though the regime is much more oppressive than in Uzbekistan. Terrorism flourishes doesn't flourish in perfect dictatorships. There got to be some kind of liberalization internally for terrorism to be able to function. That's what's happening in Uzbekistan. There was some degree of liberalization, but not enough to grow Islamic radicalism and terrorism, but not enough to foster political opposition that is the alternative to such radical groups. There is no political alternative in countries such as Uzbekistan. The opposition is completely suppressed, jailed, expelled in immigration. So this is not a way for a normal progress to develop. What to do with these countries? This is the question of questions of what to do with semi-authoritarian regimes. They have some of the components of democracy. They have elections. Very often they are flawed elections. They are with a lot of violations. They have semi-democratic institutions, some of them. Most of them are absolutely authoritarian. Look at the security services, look at the police. They're completely authoritarian with not changed mentality. So they're marking some democracy, democratic development, but internally they're very rigid autocracies. So our strategy, as I said before, should be based on our experience from before '89. When the international community started the Helsinki process, they were hoping for some warming up of relationship between the countries from the two poles. what happened was they stimulated development of reformist leadership in these countries, because once you face the Western attitude, you got a response somehow. Gorbachev came to play because of this engagement with the governments. At the same time, there was clear support for the opposition movements, for human rights groups, and we felt this support very, very much in Bulgaria in particular. And it was coming from the embassy of the United States and from other Western embassies. So that helped develop the vision of the opposition of what they wanted this country to be. And after that, it was again negotiation process. In each of the countries in Eastern Europe, there was a round table negotiating with the communist authorities of how the country is going to develop. This process has not taken place in countries such as Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or Tajikistan. And this is what we should be aiming for, to stimulate and to foster a dialogue within society to lead to a serious negotiations of how to go about future development of the country, so that radical Islamists are not allowed to take power. The question is, who are going to be the successors of Karimov? If this is going to be the opposition is non-existent. He didn't allow opposition to grow. If these are going to be the Islamists riding on public dissatisfaction, they can cause Andijans very easily. This is the danger that we're facing. So the problems were maintained, but they're coming to a boil.
Then we should say we shall see. Since we abuse, I just want to take half a minute to make 3 points. I will be up to a minute. I'm not an historian. I do theory. Just trying to draw 3 things. One, as Galia said, and in those issues, to make the distinction between conflict management and conflict resolution in terms of the involvement of third parties. The second thing is, and this was a question and we didn't have any answers, but it was interesting to try to find patterns or to develop a model to understand the successes, the conditions under which international intervention will be successful or failure. And as you say, Galia, it could be a necessary but not a sufficient condition for an eventual peace. And the third point taken from Oren is that the panel dealt mainly with states intervening. So there is a kind of bias, and this is the IR bias, that you might say this is a disjunction of third parties that they are states, even superpowers, but they are still states, trying to intervene in not interstate conflicts, but rather ethnic conflicts. And that causes some confusion. Now I think it's time for coffee.
The fourth point that you missed, I think, is maybe the most practical conclusion. Don't rush to buy stocks in these markets.
That's a practical one. Toda ba. Thank you.